Today we are looking at events that took place in the early 1930s. So sit back as we go to the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands archipelago are situated in the southeastern Pacific Ocean, directly to the west of Ecuador. The islands are collectively most famous for their role in the work of the British naturalist and evolutionary biologist Charles Darwin, who was influenced in the development of the theory of natural selection by the creatures he observed when he lived in the Galapagos Islands in the 1830s. However, they remained relatively underpopulated. The southernmost island in the Galapagos archipelago is named Floreana, and throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, it had been somewhat abandoned. For many years, the only travellers that visited were whalers who passed through as they fished the southern Pacific. The island was known for its good supply of fresh water, as well as the many plant species and animals that could be found, including penguins and lava gulls. There had long since been a wooden barrel at Post Office Bay, where sailors could leave mail that would later be picked up by ships who were on their way back to Europe or the United States. The letters would then be sent on to their desired destination. The first stirrings of an attempt at a permanent settlement on Floreana occurred in 1929, when Dr. Friedrich Ritter and his partner Dora Strauch arrived there from their native Germany. Dora had been a patient of Dr. Ritter's for some years, during which time the pair had struck up a relationship. They both subsequently left their spouses and for some reason decided to head off together for the uninhabited paradise, which they had heard so much about, situated off the coast of South America. Friedrich and Dora were an unusual pair. He had, for instance, decided to remove all his teeth before travelling to the island because he wanted to see if his gums would toughen in the wilds of Floreana. Yet perhaps this would have occurred anyway, as Dora soon lost her teeth, some of which, in the absence of any dental care, had to be pulled out with garden tools. It soon became apparent that the island paradise was not everything that they hoped it would be. Nevertheless, the couple persevered, and over the following months started to make a life for themselves in Floreana. They built their own home by clearing land on what was a fairly inhospitable landscape. They managed to raise livestock and made gardens where they grew fruit and vegetables. This was not easy work, and they now understood the reason why Floreana had remained uninhabited for so long. Their relationship also became increasingly more strained. Dora was Friedrich's junior by 15 years, and he was a domineering character. She had attended his medical practice years earlier after developing multiple sclerosis. Friedrich, whose medical methods were far from conventional, had apparently told her that she could overcome it through sheer willpower. Of course, this was not the case, and her condition deteriorated whilst living on the island, so much so that she began to walk with the aid of a cane. Life in Floreana seemed to have taken its toll on the couple, and there was no longer any affection between them. Their relationship had turned into one of increasing bitterness, and they would often refuse to talk to each other for days on end. Yet to the outside world, all was well. In order to deal with the heavy rains, interspersed with warm heats, they began to walk around the island in a state of undress. The few visitors who passed by believed that they were people who were living in some sort of colony for alternative living. They then subsequently started to take stories back to Europe and North America about the strange goings-on in the Galapagos island of Floreana. The stories about Friedrich Ritter and Dora Strauch were published in the American and European press in the early 1930s. Some newspaper stories of the couple contained excerpts from letters written by Friedrich, which had been leaked to journalists. As the stories spread, more people became interested in living there. Thus, in 1932, another couple, Heinz and Margaret Widmer, travelled to Floreana with their 13-year-old son named Harry. Margaret was pregnant when they arrived, although to many it would seem a little foolish to move to a virtually uninhabited island whilst pregnant. However, they believed that the by now famous Dr. Ritter, of whom they had read so much about, would be able to deliver the baby. Friedrich duly did so, but the relationship between the original inhabitants and the newly arrived Widmers remained otherwise fairly frosty, with Friedrich and Dora viewing the newcomers with suspicion and resentment. It was not exactly an easy life, carving out an existence on a remote Pacific island with little resources to hand. For instance, the supply of fresh water was limited, and the use of it caused tensions between the two groups. 3 meals a day were possible, but only through hours of long, arduous work. The Vitmas even took to maintaining a night watch with a rifle by their garden gate to stop the hogs pilfering their vegetables. Whilst they were building their first house on Floreana, the Vitmas had to live in a cave on the island, in which Margaret gave birth to her son, who she named Rolf. As tense as the relationship between Friedrich and Dora and the Vitmas was at times, it at least was manageable and livable, but that cannot be said for the third group, who landed on the island just a few months after the Vitmas. This was a quartet of unusual proportions. Central to the group was Eloise Bosquet de Wagner-Verhorn, an Austrian woman with pretensions of nobility who called herself the Baroness. She arrived with 2 German lovers, Alfred Lorenz and Robert Philipson, along with an Ecuadorian servant named Manuel Valdivieso. He had been hired on the mainland before departing for the Galapagos Islands. Unlike the existing 2 groups, the third party had not arrived with the goal of living a rural life and trying to be at one with nature. Rather, the Baroness had come to Floreana with grand ambitions to build a magnificent hotel from which she had planned to attract further settlers. Along with the 3 men, she quickly established herself in a makeshift homestead, which she christened Hacienda Paradise. It was all very ominous for Friedrich Ritter, Dora Strauch, and the Vitmas. The Baroness was clearly a flamboyant character, a fact exemplified in her arrival to Floreana. In the weeks that followed, she took to greeting passing ships from the shore in her swimwear, while waving a pistol around her head. Tensions quickly emerged with the other German couples. The first point of conflict was when the Vitmas began to suspect that the Baroness was somehow intercepting their letters back to civilization. These would usually be handed over to the crews of passing ships. Several of these letters ended up being printed in part by international newspapers. The original inhabitants suspected that the Baroness and her lovers were responsible for this intrusion. Strangely, the stories that appeared in print had often been sensationalized to make the Baroness appear as though she was some sort of head of the small community which had emerged on the island. Some even referred to her as the Empress of Floreana. Unsurprisingly, it was not long before there was an outright rift between the Baroness and the other German couples. This was compounded by rivalries over the limited supplies available. There was a lack of fresh water at certain times of the year, a seemingly strange quandary on a deserted island. But in addition to this, the original inhabitants and the Vitmas had always been reliant to some extent on contributions of good or bartered items from the crew of the few ships which passed and made anchor at Floreana. This was fine, so long as the number of inhabitants on the island was relatively small. But once the Baroness's party arrived, she began to interrupt this primitive trade. This was further compounded after a few months, when problems developed within Hacienda Paradise itself. One of the Baroness's lovers, Alfred Lorenz, was often mistreated by her, and it was clear that she favoured her other lover, Robert Philipson. When the tensions between the trio became unbearable for Alfred, he would often seek refuge with the Wittmer family. He would arrive at their home, complaining about the treatment he was receiving. They provided him with a place to stay for a while, but Mrs. Margaret Wittmer was not so easily taken in by his tales and his distressed state. She secretly considered him to be weak for allowing himself to be treated in this way. Something very strange happened on the island on the 27th of March 1934, when the Baroness and her favourite lover, Robert Philipson, quite suddenly and inexplicably vanished. Margaret Wittmer believed that they had boarded and left on a passing ship, which was heading to the southeastern Pacific island of Tahiti. But if the Baroness and Robert Philipson did in fact set sail for Tahiti, they never arrived. There is also no record of any such ship ever having passed through the Galapagos at that time on its way to Tahiti. So what did happen to them, as they were both no longer seen on Floreana? Mrs. Wittner's account was not corroborated by others. Dora Strauch claimed that she heard a loud shriek shortly before the Baroness and Robert disappeared. She also claimed that there was no ship that passed by the island at that time. Dora's version of events is further supported by the fact that the Baroness's and Robert's possessions were all left at Hacienda Paradise. If they had left on the ship, they had taken nothing with them. It does not end there. As soon as the Baroness disappeared, her Ecuadorian servants boarded the next boat that stopped and headed back to civilization. Shortly thereafter, Alfred Lorentz, the final member of the Baroness's party, apparently convinced a fishing ship to take him on board on its journey to San Cristobal, the Galapagos Island that is home to the oldest permanent settlement and is the island where Charles Darwin first went ashore in 1835. Alfred had planned to take another ship from there that would convey him to the South American mainland. Months later, the fisherman and Lorentz were discovered dead on the beach of Marchena, another island off the coast of Ecuador. This island, however, does not have a freshwater supply. Given what happened previously, people started to wonder if they had simply died of thirst, or if something more sinister had occurred. Another death followed back in Floreana. In November 1934, Friedrich Ritter died of apparent food poisoning. A severe drought on the island had left the inhabitants with meagre food supplies, and Dora and he had apparently boiled a dead chicken. But it was later suggested that it was suspicious that Dora was perfectly fine after eating it, but Friedrich not only became ill, but so sick that he died. In the memoirs which they subsequently composed, Margaret and Dora provided wildly different versions of Friedrich's death. Margaret claimed Friedrich had been unable to speak, but had looked at Dora with hatred and scribbled a note which suggested she might have poisoned him. Following the doctor's death, Dora left Floreana and returned to Germany. Her multiple sclerosis created further health complications in the years that followed, and she died in 1943, though not before writing her memoir of events on the island. Conversely, the Wittmers stayed on the island and built a hotel, which began to attract tourists from the 1950s onwards. Heinz died in 1960, but Margaret lived there until her death in the year 2000. Their son Rolf, who was born on the island shortly after they had arrived in the early 1930s, lived there for most of his life, running a yachting company. Further stories emerged over the years concerning the events on Floreana at this time, many of which we can most likely dismiss. One suggested that the Baroness seduced the governor of the Galapagos Islands. Another proposed that she had shot and killed a visitor to the island during a hunting trip, while a third tale is that she threatened to shoot a honeymooning couple who had planned to visit the island, so they immediately returned to their small boat and headed back out to sea. There is no answer to what happened on Floreana in the early 1930s. It seems most likely that somebody killed the Baroness and Robert Philipson, but who did it is open to conjecture. Nearly everyone else on the island had a motive: the jilted lover or one of the original inhabitants, whose lives had been upended by her arrival. Similarly, it is curious, but no evidence was left, and there are no witnesses, given the close-knit nature of the settlement. When it comes to the other deaths, there is possibly greater clarity. Although Lorentz's death shortly after leaving Floreana appears suspicious, it was ruled at the time as death by dehydration, and seems to have simply been a strange coincidence that it occurred so soon after the disappearance of the Baroness and Robert. And finally, there is no clarity as to what happened to Friedrich Ritter. Perhaps he did simply die of food poisoning, or maybe Dora Strauch did murder the man who had treated her multiple sclerosis in such a poor fashion, and then dragged her off to a remote Pacific island where he neglected her. We can be certain that the environment of jealousies, rivalries, and tension meant that things took a more sinister turn and led to events which remain unsolved to this day. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case.